Right. Good afternoon, everybody. We are lucky enough to have this afternoon, and it was very difficult to get it going, but we managed to achieve what we were set out to do, and it's a great privilege to have this afternoon Aubrey to speak to us. Aubrey is an experienced man in genealogy, and he's been assisting with school children in writing up their family histories, and he concentrates more on the oral side, of which we are all interested in. So without much further ado, I'm not going to, you don't want to listen to me. I'm going to hand over to Aubrey to carry on. Aubrey, can you carry on? Carry on, Aubrey.
Okay, good afternoon, David. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to be with you this afternoon. And I am going to first go into the agenda for today, the speech or talk that I've prepared. It's a long preparation. I hope you can see it. I put it on my screen. Now, David, could you answer? I have 5 points on our talk. The one is researching. Number 2 is recording. Number 3 is reflecting. Number 4 is relating. And number 5 is writing. So we had learned about the 3 R's those days. And coming from Worcester with an Afrikaans environment, I could not make sense out of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And it was much later in life that I decided, all right, then we're going to do the 5 R's today and be a bit up on our educational system. Researching is what most of you, if not all of you, have been doing for a long time. And as far as that's concerned, I'm more or less sure that I will come and have to ask you about stuff. Sherry made me believe that there will be lots of people who are new to the scene, and I don't see any new people here. I just see the real experienced genealogists. Okay, then in terms of just to complete that section, then to run very quickly through them will be publications first. When we research, we do not have to start at the bottom trying to rediscover the wheel. Lots of people have already written, as you know, and there are lots of publications available. And nowadays, with the availability of the internet and all these websites where companies then publish their stuff, it makes it so much more easier for us to get information. And then obviously EXA, I have had the privilege of doing a chat with them also not so long ago. They have a lot of stuff available. The GISA has stuff. Then also the Huguenot Society, they have a lot of stuff also available. So if you from the European background in South Africa, you will not be stuck. There's also a lot of work done for our British settlers. Publications are available, and that will also help you. Then we have the GISA records of 17 volumes covering most of our families. And there are some of us who are serious about stuff, and we will find certain discrepancies there in GISA's books. But the main thing is that people have spent lots and lots of hours, time, money, effort on compiling those. And I believe they are busy with the new updated one, which will be available sometime 22. That's what I heard last. So publications is our first one on researching. The second one on researching, for newcomers, their own knowledge, they will then load their own knowledge onto a family tree, and they will also go to family members and start with oral research. And this is one of the breakthroughs in relationships. Very often we tend to be, as researchers, we tend to be caught up in our own little world. And there's a lot of knowledge out there. And it is so lovely to go around to people, make contact with them, start talking to them, and start, this is important part, listening to them. Now, there was a hint earlier on the oral history. Many of people in the colored community are struggling when they start doing their research, because we have certain traditions there. And one of the traditions was that when we talk about other people, we're skinnering, the word is skinner. And we have this tradition that I grew up with, that one. We get together for a braai or for a family meeting, and the boys and the men will gather around the braai or the potjie, and the women will sit around there doing the salads and stuff like that. And amongst our ladies especially, they will chat. They will chat about people. They will know about stuff of people which other people don't know about. And they will actually talk about their own family and so on, but then it will have this other tail attached to it that that people don't talk about. Do you know that that one that's going around and saying that's a husband's child, I'm sure it's not a husband's child, because husband wasn't there during that time. He was working on contract at Saldanha or something like that. Now, those things gave a kind of a negative connotation to family research. So people are automatically defensive when we start asking them questions. Now, just yesterday, I was fortunate to have had a discussion with a young man, prominent figure, who was going to get some information from his dad for me, for our work together. And we had to go into an orientation for him, basically explaining to him that it will be so that our older people, your dad in this case, will feel confronted when you start asking him questions. It is better to first establish a bond and then in general talk about himself. And people love that. People love talking about themselves. And to be attentive, to listen to what he is saying, and use what he is saying as a connecting point for further questions that you might have, but in the meantime also to develop the ability to tune in completely to what that person says, but also in the back of your mind to guide the discussion into knowledge about them, about that person's circumstances, and then also to get prepared for the type of things that you want to relate to Aubrey, which will then contribute to your biography or to your family story, the book that you are going to publish. We're getting to that still. Now, the oral history is a very interesting one. We can come back to that one, certain experiences that we have had. Our overall discussion still covers the archives. Now, it is so that with the advent of all the information on internet, that many of my students will come in and tell me, Aubrey, I have found a lot of stuff on the internet, and here's the stuff that I found, but these people seem to not be connected to my people, but they have the same names. They have the second names the same. They are in more or less the same era, but how come they're not connected to me? Now, that is part of the problem that we're sitting with, that when we go into the internet and the the websites, and we get a lot of information. It doesn't really say that we are connected. It can lead us onto some side paths, and we're not getting to our own self and our own things. But now in the archives, we will then get the estate files. We will find death notices, which most of you know about. You will also know, and then for young people, for younger researchers or newer researchers, everything on that estate file is important. There will be implications and information there that's not just the genealogical information per se, who were the children and who were the parents. There will be other things written in there, hidden, like there will be something about how long the person was ill. There will be something about the reference to the will. There will be something about the first marriage and the second marriage, and you will find there that whether the children belong or were in the first marriage, whether they were before the first marriage or out of wedlock, as some people call it. And also, there are little things that one finds there. Then at the Western Cape Archives, we still have Home Affairs records. Now, Jaco has explained to me those days that at some point, Home Affairs didn't have storage for all their documents, and they came to the archives in Queen Victoria Street, and Jaco's team started indexing all of that stuff. So those are still available, but Jaco will also be able to lead us in terms of how will this POPI Act play a role in us having access to those documents, say after 1921. Okay, but those documents are there. You can get Home Affairs records of birth, up to 1970, 71, Home Affairs records of deaths, Home Affairs records of marriages, and then those are the Home Affairs records in general. The process to get there, you first you have to know the name and surname of the person and a general idea of when that person was born. Or then if you look in the death records, you will have to know where, more or less when he died, she died. With that knowledge, you will find an index of the town where she was born or died. And from that, in that index, you find a number. And from that number, you then go to the register, you request the register, and the register will then give you more detail of that person. When he was born in the birth registers and when he died in the death registers. An interesting thing that came out up on Friday or Thursday when I was there, Thursday, there was a lady whose date of birth was the 4th of January, 1964, recorded in the government records. But her birthday, according to her parents, and then also on her ID, is the 5th of January, 1964. And now she wanted to apply for a Portuguese passport because they are originally, or her parents were from Madeira. And the children are now in Europe, and in England is the one, and she wanted to go there. Now you can just imagine the drama at the archives when the person came in there stressed already and now wanting to know how this one thing and the other thing, and this government must now change her birthday to the 5th because she was sure that she was born on the 5th. Her mother said so, and here is on the 4th now in the government records. And it's just, you and I know that the government record is the final thing. That's the obvious thing. But now she is so tense about it, and eventually she got hold of me and that another 45 minutes of my research time. Nevertheless, I could facilitate that and actually give her further advice as how to try and actually sort out that problem. In the archives, we will find, which we often neglect, lots of other information on on people. Their court cases, before, for example, there are lots of court cases from the 1600s, and we might find names there which are related to us. There are also immigration papers, which most of you know about. There are passenger lists. And then what helped me, was a huge eye-opener for me, was the voters roll. So my great-great-great-grandfather, for example, Aubrey Springveldt, excuse me, was on the 1853 voters roll. And then that brought us also into the contextualizing of our history. I'll come back to that one again. Then we also have in the archives, which many of you know about, the opgaafrollen, the census rolls, which, it says what it means. People who had property, they had to pay tax, and that would be listed. Now, I think University of Cape Town and other people have been, Stellenbosch, they've been busy transcribing those records so that they can also have that on computer and for us as researchers. Now, that in general, just to cover what you will find in the archives. What will help the new beginner, as also if you have time and you can go back, because very often we find just a reference number in the research on computer, and then we go and look for that reference number and find a reference number in the archives, and that will also help us to give a broader set of information on our ancestors. The one neglected one still is the church records. Our church records have traditionally been in our churches. Now, because our Dutch Reformed Church had been our prominent church in the beginning, Dutch East India Company time, therefore, we actually have the records of those early baptisms, which included, for my sake and the researchers of slave and descent, included the slaves. And here and there, we also had Khoi people who were baptized. In our church records, we will also find the baptism, the minutes, the marriage records. And there's also sometimes when we do the forensic analysis of these marriage registers, we can look at who the witnesses were. And that gives us another set of information to link ourselves to those specific people. We also have minutes of meetings. Now that's the slog, the hard work. For us who do not know much about our ancestors in the colored community, if you may, there are those minutes of meetings which will sometimes tell us who were members of the Kerkraad, the church council, who were the leaders in the societies, in the clubs, and also we sometimes even find that the record of people's monthly or weekly contribution to the church coffers. Because those days we had a card. When I was a little boy, we had a card, and everyone who became a member of the congregation had a card, and the executive of the church would have a person coming to your house and have a short prayer meeting, and then you pay your money, your 10 shillings or your shilling a month towards the coffers of the church. And it is so lovely to be able to find those records and see your parents and grandparents, great-grandparents' names there. It's so wonderful for the romantic researcher. The transfers are also recorded. So we often have then, the person was a member of a church in Woopstad, and then that person went to Kimberley, and then the children were further born in Kimberley. And the link in the registers would be the transfer record, which then will help us to find the other children of that person who might be in our line in the Kimberley church, for example. And then about the churches, we know that some of our church records, some of our churches are at specific central places. So the Dutch Reformed Church records, there are copies at the archives, but the original records and also copies of records are at the church archives in Stellenbosch. Now, I was there last week, and I was also reminded of the Poppy Act, and that we won't have access to those after 1921. It will be a challenge. Jaco talked about it earlier on. It's not just because when we talk about the people who are writing books and those who are doing masters and doctorates and so on, they obviously will have to make those footnotes. No? But in our case, where we just work with, basically, many of us just work with the connection between myself and my father and my grandfather, who in our cases were then born before the 1920s, but younger people who start with their research will have a challenge to get to their grandparents of the 1940s, for example, further back to the 1920s. But they will cross the bridge when they get there. Another research point, I've had 1, publications, 2, own knowledge, 3, archives there, 4, church records, and 5 is burials. Now we find on the internet, obviously, also the burials, and the burial gave us such basic information: where the person was buried, when the person was buried, what type of grave he was in, and who the company was, and then also when he died or when she died. Here and there, we have a spouse's name, yeah? Here and there. But in most of these burial records, there's nothing else about them. But it also gives us a little bit more information, because if one contextualizes it, then it tells us that a person was buried in, say, Maitland or Waltermade, then we would know that his death would have been in this area. And in some cases, they also have his last address. And that will also help us with further completing a bigger picture of our ancestors. Those are burials. Then there are also records on the internet. I know Giza has done a lot of research on that, of headstones or tombstones, and that can also be seen. The last place that was quite exciting for me was the National Library. Not just the masses of books that they have there on people, and where hints are here and there about the people that are in our line, but they're also the newspapers of the different regions, the different areas. And it's actually wonderful to go and sit in the National Library and scroll through the newspapers of Worcester of 1840 and see what has been happening there, because I come from Worcester. And then all the names of people are mentioned. Just like it. That's the other one, where we can actually get some information about our ancestors to complete a picture other than just the names and the surname, and when they were born and when they died and when they got married. Okay. Then comes the recording, and especially for my new researchers, I emphasize the fact that the recording of the sources is of utmost importance, because I don't know whether it happened to you, but it happened to me already, that I have written up something and then I ask myself 20 years later, now I just want to recheck this one, because there might be more information, since I'm now more clever than 20 years ago. I've not recorded where I found it. And then comes the big thing, to go back, retrace my steps, and then to find that record again. So in order to pre-warn them. That is a thing that I often, in more than one session, repeat. So then I also explain to them the difference between the family tree, which starts with themselves and goes to their progenitor, or as closely as possible to their progenitor, and then also the difference between that and the family register, which they then can from there, or we start from the progenitor and down and connect all the families. So in that whole picture, you can just imagine when we have the person for the first time, it is overwhelming if we give them all of that. So we start off gradually with the family tree, with himself, herself, the oral history, the stuff that they have themselves, and then little by little work further and further back. And then at the beginning of my sessions, I also normally facilitate a feedback session where for about half an hour is my plan. Often it goes longer, where they talk together, they discuss what they were looking for and what they have found and how they felt about finding them. And inevitably, if we have a group of 5, you can imagine I can't give them more than 5 minutes each, because otherwise we'll sit there and we spend our morning that we have to get into the archives chatting about those things. Then my third point of the 5 R's is the reflecting. Now, we have had and discovered a lot of information. But for many of us, when we discover that, we want to discuss it with somebody. And I don't know whether it's with you the case, but most of my students and colleagues, they become colleagues later on, they say that, they have problems at home when they start talking about their discoveries, because their wives or husbands don't want to hear this anymore. They have to sound. So what we suggest is more of those meetings that we have right in the beginning with each other. Call each other, talk to each other, liaise, share, and brag, drink tea, and discuss and get some more input from the other. So this is in that reflection thing very important. And when we reflect, we also look at our ancestors, where they live, instead of just being glad that I found something and writing it down, where they lived. We can find in the estate records also what they had, the farms' names. But we will also find in the estate records and in the L&D records, we will find the distribution of their assets. And that gives us a further picture about them and about their circumstances. So the reflecting for me means we can actually also look at them in their local circumstances against the background of their regional circumstances and against the background of the global circumstances. Now, okay, we had the European progenitor. We have found him. He came from Germany in most cases, fewer from the Netherlands, fewer from other countries. I'm talking about the beginning. Later on, obviously, the British government would try and get as many people as possible who were loyal to the Queen to come to the new colony. The circumstances that led to them taking the option of coming to a faraway country which they knew nothing about, only had rumors about, and their youth, what were those circumstances? And when we look at our Germans, for example, masses of them in the period 1652 till 1700, the German history 1618 till 1648, the 30-Year War, Germany burned down and bombed down and shot down. 2 generations of war, little education, but then also the circumstances of the time where the big merchants, big companies needed men, strong men, to safeguard their possessions, trade possessions, and so on, and then also their territories that they have taken over. And those were the ancestors, and those were our progenitors. And the type of life that they found here within that global scenario, and then also the trust that they had to have with the company that gave them work and then gave them land, and then they were left on their own. And once we get into that reflecting, we now covers locally, regionally, globally, our general history, our economic history of our ancestors, as well as the lifestyle of our ancestors. Are you not still with me? Okay. Then, within that framework, we start making connections. Some people have grand words, they call it a spiritual connection and so on. But we make connection, and that connection helps us get into subjectively into this, into a loving relationship with our ancestors, to understand them, to try to begin to relate a story in our mind, and we can love them. We can love them and respect them for those circumstances that they had to encounter there and then also here under the different authorities. And we can also be analytical. And we can learn to love them within their context. Because one of the major mistakes society makes is to try and judge people of 100 years ago based on norms that we apply today, based on rules and laws that we apply today. I personally think that we have to break that prejudice and get to a point where we go through the barriers and actually acknowledge that our ancestors were sometimes forced by their own circumstances to apply lifestyles, to apply orders, to apply stratification of society for their own survival. But to acknowledge that and to know that, and to know that we have inherited certain general norms which we now can reflect about objectively and analytically and make a new, fresh start with our own fresh, new narrative, which is our last R, when we start writing it for ourselves. And then we give a totally new narrative where we can actually tell people, okay, those were the systems. We have inherited those systems, but here we are. Our minds are changing. The narrative is changing. The words we're using are now changing, because this is Genealogy 2021. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you, David. And I thank you for the opportunity to have been your speaker today. I feel honored.
Aubrey, thank you very much for the most enlightening discussion. I think we've all sat and enjoyed it. It's very difficult when you have to speak on Zoom, because you don't know the reaction of the people that are sitting behind them, and you don't know whether they're listening to you or gone off to make a cup of tea, or what are they actually doing. But I think everybody, from the kind of attention everybody's paid to it, I think everybody was totally absorbed in what you were saying. And the two things that stand out for me the most is, one is the National Library, and I think that a lot of researchers overlook the information that is in the National Library, as you said, rightly pointed out, of all the local newspapers and other literature that's there. There is a wealth of information in that building, and it's only there to find. And the other one is judgmental of our ancestors. It's very difficult, as you rightly say, to say how life was like 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and who was doing what. But I think it is important that we do not judge what they did. We can't compare how they lived and their circumstances in that time. And you very aptly put it. We need to respect those ancestors. But thank you very much. I don't know if anybody else has got any questions. If you'd like to ask Aubrey a question, I'm sure Aubrey will be very happy to respond to you. All you need to do is just to unmute yourself on your mic at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, and then you can speak away, and let's hear some questions from the floor. Thank you very much.
Aubrey, may I ask a question, please?
Carry on.
I've done a fair amount of research on my own family, and we've got a variety of roots that go back to Europe and to the UK. I also have mixed race ancestry, and I have friends who have asked me to research for them on their mixed race families. I've recently been looking for somebody who had a very British sounding surname, but they are a mixed race family. And I find it very hard to research and find records, as you so rightly said earlier in the beginning of your talk. I find it really difficult to source information and find accurate information for quite often for mixed race families.
We're not proud. Okay, it's a recording in progress. I get advice. the people came out of a system which they didn't make, but they were not proud of it, because they in a colored community would since then talk about their white ancestors, their so-called European ancestors, their British ancestors, but they won't mention the other one, because you can must see I'm black, no. You can must see I'm colored, no. You can must see I got the kruiskop, no. So no. So, okay, but I'm not just that. And then in some cases, we will say we're from St. Helena, because you were British if we were for St. Helena, and our St. Helena people were very proud. So they have a lot to be proud of. And so they don't want to tell you more, or they don't know more about themselves. Sherry, we start with ourselves. With ourselves, our own family, like you do on your family tree, your normal family tree. Then your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and you go up to a certain point where you can't get any further. And then you have the siblings of there where you don't get any further, because where your great-grandfather is not necessarily mentioned, your great-grandfather's brother or sister or any other of the siblings might be mentioned. And then you cross that line. Then the other thing which I've hinted on earlier on also is that we have a transfer record from Worcester, where all of us were. My family were all in Worcester and the Rhenish Church those days. And then they had to get a transfer record because they got a job in Cape Town. Well, the daddy got a job in Cape Town, and he was a member, and then he gets a job in Cape Town, and he comes and he belongs to the church in District 6, the Dutch Reformed Church or the Sendingkerk in District 6, and then he gets transferred. And now, because of that transfer record, we know now we can come and look up in District 6, or we can come and look up in the Boerkaap, or we can look up in St. Stephen's in the center of Cape Town, or we can look up in Long Street, and the church records are there, normally at the churches, or then the Dutch Reformed Church has now, for the last few years, had been busy with our colored churches, if you may, to request that they send their records for safekeeping to the archives in Stellenbosch, which will also be a great help in the centralization. And as we know also, my heritage has also done a lot of recording of those records. And then also, when we get there with the church, we can compare that eventually with slave records.
Aubrey, can I ask
Hello,
you?
Anne? Of course.
Along those same lines, I have a slave ancestor. Her father was a slave. I have his name. I have his manumission papers, but I cannot find anything about either of them apart from that. I do know that she was ongedoop, because on her marriage certificate, which they only got married after they'd had 10 or 11 children, I think the dominee came along and said, you've got to get married. In the Weinberg Church, yes, in the Weinberg, Dutch Reformed Church, is in the slave registers. So I've got her name, I've got her children, I've got everything like that, but I cannot find anything about her because she didn't belong to a church.
Right, good question. You see, in that case, if we know who all the children were, and she lived in the Weinberg area, we'd go to the archives, file 121, Yaku, and then we will look up in that area who were all the slave owners. And the mother, since 1816, the mother and the children had to be registered. Now, if you are lucky to already have the children's names, so then we go to that slave register, and if we find that a woman by the name of Sarah who had the children Aronki and Liesel and Pamela, and who would be matched with that, then especially if there are 10 children already, then it will be one of those nice things to do, forensic research, to actually get there. And then from there we can look at the different auction rolls, the auction records, which I haven't mentioned, that also at the archives. And then also that will also help you to find where did they come from. And if she was very young, then they would say there, if she was herself born at the Cape, that will be, say, then the mother will be Mina van die Kaap. That will imply or say that she was born at the Cape, a Creole slave. In the case of Mina van Madagascar, would be then she came from Madagascar. And the very important thing here is that now we at that level where more and more of us also depend on genetic research. And with the genetic research, we can then concentrate on the mother's line. The general tendency is to do the father's surname, okay? Because this our tradition here was the tradition of the father's surname is the only one that was acknowledged. But according to our DNA testing, our mother's genes will come from our mother, or her mother, from her mother, and from her mother. And the challenge is then, if you want to do that X chromosome line, is then to do the mother's line in order to find where our slave mother come from. And so in that way, we also get to that reflecting and relating level, reflecting on a woman as a young child of 8, being abducted somewhere and shoved in with a lot of other slaves, just bounty in a ship in bad circumstances where other people are dying and stinky and sweaty and whatever else, and sick and coughing. And then she must be brought for so many weeks and months on this boat, and then be stopped off halfway on a beach, and then they would be branded with a hot iron and oil first on their bodies, so that when somebody dies on the ship, the owner knows that was his slave that died. The captain knows. And then we go into that reflecting and relating, and it they become real.
That doesn't really help me. I understand that. I really appreciate that feeling. My problem is I only know that her father was manumitted. And there is no record of him anywhere apart from that manumission. So he obviously wasn't a VOC slave. And I cannot find who he belonged to.
Okay. What year was that?
He was manumitted in 1795. And at about the same time, his daughter, Mina van der Kaap, or Mina Botha, or Wilhelmina, was about the time she took up with my great-great-great-great-grandfather. Because I'm
Mina Botha.
born.
Do you say Mina Botha?
Yeah.
There is a story about the Botha line. There is a history about the Bothas. You have checked that one.
Yeah, that's
about the DNA of the Bothas.
Yeah, I agree with you.
You can check that one. There is a story about the DNA of the Bothas.
So where would I be able to find that?
You can even go onto the internet and Google Botha research, DNA research Botha. There is something about the Bothas there.
Okay.
Okay, and then but I would truly also ask there to consider that when you do that that father, and you have his children now, and then
I've got
try
her children. Her
eh,
children. I've got her children.
her children. So
Yeah.
was he one of her children, or was he a husband?
No, he was the father.
Okay, he was the father, because they don't record the father with the children. There was only the mother. The principle was that the father was irrelevant, you know. And so, as far as he is concerned, if you with the sons and you do the family register, because you have that now, and you go down the line, all the males, and you get a living male, and his DNA can be tested, and his Y will tell you more about him. Because unfortunately, we have with our slave ancestry, we have that issue, because the slaves were not people. The slaves were
Yeah.
possessions. They were possessions. So they were not people, and therefore there was no reason to have them anywhere recorded, but in terms of functionality, what were their functions here? And this is the objectivation of people that because they were on the same level as the sheep and the cows and so on. So, but then fortunately we have the science now, and the science can open that. The science can open that locked door for you, and you can then find what was his identity, and we can then see that he would have come from that part of the world or that part of the world, for example. But further than that, it's a spiritual journey.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Anne.
Can I, Aubrey, can I come in here? Listen, yeah, one has a general way of going about the research, but with genealogy, that where you have a group of people where you don't have a lot of sources, or you don't know which way to specifically go, one must always consider it's a unique case. So there will be unique sources that applies to one of the slave people, which would not apply to the others. And that uniqueness determines, like you would say, the person was in Worcester or Laingsburg, or then you have to start splitting the generalization or the generalized rules. It's every one of those further searches is a unique search.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there isn't, one cannot, you know what I mean? Genealogy can, you know, then what is that? Forensic research. Then you move away from all the general sources we all know. And then it becomes complicated. But yeah, normally you look from the one source leads you to the other source.
Yeah.
As
we're brainstorming, Jaco. Thank you, man. As we're brainstorming, that is absolutely true. That the individuality of the case the suggestion, and that just makes it complicated. No, not complicated. It goes into that forensic level. If Anne can, for example, find the woman owners, there's a good chance
those records are there.
There's a good chance that the husband would have been in the same vicinity. Okay.
Or on the same,
farm.
Property.
That's on
the same property, or in the same street in the town, or what have you. Yeah.
And then we get the general reading that we are doing. It might just be that as the Spirit leads Anne, that she will get onto a reference to a man who was a post rider, who has the same name, and he brought the post to this place when he was attacked, and his owner came up with this and that type of thing. Because as we read more, we actually find these connections. But as you say, it is absolutely true. It's unique. We can use the general as a reference, a frame of reference. But it's the personal thing that actually helps us, and that what makes forensic research such an interesting and a satisfying activity.
Yeah, there's no initial GPS. You just got to go for it.
Thanks, Jaco. Thanks, Jaco.
Can I just chip in quickly? I see there's a written question from JCW. I don't know who that is, but they said, "Hi, Aubrey. How would I trace my grandfather's roots? Born 1911, died young 1947. Assumed an orphan, lived in District 6. My father was 6 years old when he died, and my grandmother says they didn't discuss these things then." So that's very much a similar case to things you've mentioned.
Okay. If JCW, hello, if he died 1911,
he was born.
He was born 1911. If we have an exact date and we have his name and surname,
birth register.
Yes.
Okay, then we go into, as Jaco say, the archives, and we look for his birth index in the birth index, and we find a number, and from that number we go to the birth register, and that birth register will give his name, where he was born, and also where his residential address was of his parents, who was his father, who was his mother, and who was the person who was the informant about his birth. And often we have there another relative, the father or the mother. In many cases, if there was not a father acknowledged, then it's only the mother's name there. And then also, if you have to have an idea of which place he was born, which town did he come from, or which, if he was in the city, wonderful. Because we have records of, at this stage, of most of the Western Cape, Eastern Cape, Northern Cape, but then there are some towns missing. And then when the towns are missing, and we're fortunate to have them as Christians, then we will go and look in the church records, baptism records.
That's correct.
Okay. Thanks, Aubrey. This is Jean-Andre. I got stuck at the birth index because our assumption was that, and we've got all of that details. We've got his name, full name, his birth date. But the birth index, I didn't come right with that. I went through loads and loads of those, bounded books and couldn't find any entries.
Okay, let's converse. Where was he born?
We can't be certain, but we assume it was in the Cape Town district.
Okay, but there's lots of possibilities there. Because
Okay,
each area had its own register. There was a register for Rondebosch. There was a register for Wynberg. There was a separate register for. So that.
Yeah. So I sort of worked my way. I worked my way from Cape Town, sort of down the train line to Wynberg, etc. Looked through those books, but I didn't come right. Yeah.
But look, there is the main two ones are Cape Town and Wynberg, but then there's some odd ones in between where the archivist behind the desk has to then look a bit further to assist you. Like for example, Woodstock stuff or Mowbray. They had at one point up to about from 1908 to 1928, a lot of those municipalities were separate from Cape Town in terms of administration. So they had their own set of registers, and they all amalgamated back into the Greater Cape Town in 1928, and then everything changed again. So being a researcher, you're not going to know those little intricate details. You'll have to ask archivists for assistance behind the desk, and they've got to go and then specifically follow your unique case.
Yeah. It's true, Jaco. I support that. There's also JCW. There's also, Jaco, the rural. Remember, there's some rural records, and I have found some stuff in rural which is not like kind of connected to a specific suburb. It's just
Yeah.
called rural.
Yeah, and remember, say for example, in 1908 or 1911, or I'm just making any date, there were places that were rural that are now not rural anymore. Remember, Cape Town is not 100 years ago. Cape Town wasn't even a quarter of the size it was now. It is now. So
Yeah.
one's got to consider everything. For example, I'm sitting here in Belleville. There was no Belleville in 1921. So there was just a Urbanville station. There was no people living here.
Yeah.
Or it was farm ground. It was rural. But now it's become part of the greater Cape Town. So one's got to consider all the facts.
And then another thing is, if JCW, this is going to take time, but if they say he died young, and you know that he was born in 1911, how will you cordon off the term young? Will it be 5 years?
Oh no,
15
yeah,
years?
no, you had my dad. I've got the exact death date, and I found that was the one and only line I could find in the archives. Just one line that stated that he died of pneumonia.
Okay, but did you have a date of his death?
Yes, I did.
Did he have a will?
No, intestate.
Intestate. Okay, then is there a death notice under their estates?
Well, there was just one line in, saying the date of his death, and
that was probably the death register then. The death register of the place where he died. Yeah, not the Home Affairs death register. It wouldn't have been a estate.
Yeah, and no court records at all with his name.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, you don't have too much to go.
And did they write in that death record his address, that death register?
Yes, they did.
Okay. Now, JCW, if you have a death, if you have an address, your next step will be to go to the churches in that area.
Oh yes, no, I yeah, okay.
Most of our people belong to a church. If you were colored and you wanted to get to a job, a proper job, then you have to have two testimonials. The one was from another person whom you worked for, and the other one was from the church.
The minister.
Yeah. So our people were. That's one of the ways in which our system actually got people to become members of churches, converted. And a very interesting thing, that is to answer your question, to go to the churches, to look at all those churches in the area where you have the address of, and then also there will be some kind of inkling whether they were Anglican or whether they were Afrikaans or English, Dutch Reform, and then many of our people were also members of the Wesleyan Church, and the Wesleyan churches you will find in also in centralized in the Eastern Cape.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean the District 6 information that we do.
You can go to Senat for District 6.
Added into the Moravian Church, but we don't know.
Yeah, you can. The Moravian Church have all the records in Genadendal.
Yeah.
So you can
think the marriage certificate may,
with Mr. Baikies, he is there at Genadendal. He'll be very pleased to help you. And then also, you see that there's another thing. The moment you say Moravian, it brings in another part of that reflecting, relating, and actually also the forensic side, because the Moravian Church decided to establish that church there for specific reasons, and one of those is that because of depression, people migrated to town, and people became like kind of taken up into the church, the town subculture, and there was a need for a church. And so we have the Moravian, the church on the hill there because of that, you know. So yes, and then also the Moravians, they would not necessarily have been from Genadendal. They could have been from Elim, from Mamre, from any of our Moravian churches, because that is actually how we actually started thinking of ourselves in terms of our denominational identity. Up to the point where sometimes I had to ask people now, you know, what are you? Are you first this member of the church, or are you first a Christian? And then people were saying, yeah, but that doesn't make sense, Aubrey. It doesn't make sense. I'm first a Moravian. That is it, you know, because that was our identity. We established our identity in terms of the church that we belong to, because there was no other, we were deprived of a political identity, if you may, that we could be proud of, because we were subjugated.
Mhm.
Aubrey, I'd like to ask a question.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Aubrey.
Okay, JCW.
Gus Anderson, can he ask a question?
Of course, thank you.
Okay, I was interested to know that copies of newspapers, old newspapers, can be found at the archives. I was going to head to Ceres, where my family grew up, and go to the local library and look for something like that.
Okay.
Would that be an option, as opposed to, or would it be easier to go to the National Archives?
The National Library. There's a difference. The National Library is that building in the center of town next to the company gardens. Yeah?
Okay.
And they have these the records of our old newspapers. There are some limited number of newspapers at the archives, Jaco, and they're also
very limited.
Very limited. And Jaco can also tell you about the books. They also have a lovely library, but that's packed up at the moment because of renovations that are planned. So therefore, we are actually delivered to the National Library. That's not to confuse the two. Yeah, the National Library.
Okay.
They have the magazines from and newspapers.
So going to the National Library as opposed to going to the Ceres Library. Would the Ceres Library
the National
have such
Library
old newspapers? Andy?
Yes, the National Library.
Yeah, but if I went to Ceres, the Ceres Library wouldn't have it, would they?
Can I come in here? It all depends. Some have, but they wouldn't have complete sets. They would have the odd newspaper that was donated to them or someone collected. If they had a smart librarian, they maybe have collected some. So it's not going to be the same pattern, but National Library has complete sets.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, this is John Robertson. Could I ask a question, please?
Of course.
No, I just wanted, it's a very brief question, but how accessible is the National Library and archives? Can one just arrive there? Do you have to make an appointment? If you don't mind, somebody could just answer that.
Yeah, no, the general principle at the archives is you are welcome, but to Pele applies, you know, they're there for the people. You can just go in. It will be advisable if you also phone them before, just to say you're looking for something specific, and because that's what we do also. At the National Library, it's the same thing. You can just walk in, but if you want to make sure that you that somebody knows about you, it does help that you phone in and say, listen, I want to come in on Monday, and I'm looking for this and that, and then somebody makes a note of that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, Aubrey. Thank you.
Okay, John.
Yeah, the National Library, sometimes you have to fill in an application form for a card, which they don't withhold from you. They issue it straight away. So there is just a little bit of a registration process that happens, but you don't have to make an appointment.
Thank you, David. Thanks.
Can I just come in here? Just make sure at the present moment, both the National Library and the archives don't keep to their normal hours with the COVID regulations. So the archives is now only open from 8 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon, where they used to be like open right through till 4 o'clock. And they had additional times Thursday evening, Saturday mornings, but that's closed now because of COVID. And I think that same thing would apply to the library. They're very strict now. They limit the number of people. If they already have, say, 15 visitors at the archives, they're sort of like not too keen to make you go in now at the moment.
Thank you, Jaco. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I
Thanks.
also comment about the newspapers? A lot of them have microfilmed at the National Library, but some of them aren't, and therefore you have to phone ahead if you want to look at some of the weird and wonderful. Maybe the series one you might require to sort of phone ahead so they can get them from the warehouse for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Aubrey, another request. Are we able to share your contact details?
Yeah, by all means, you're welcome.
So your email address, would that be the best way to contact
That
you?
will be the best way.
Okay.
You have it?
No.
It's aubrey.capemix52@gmail.com.
Repeat, please.
Aubrey, AUBREY .capemix52. That's a mix of the Cape @gmail.com.
Thank you.
It's
Type it
lowercase.
in the comments.
It's lowercasing Aubrey.
Thank you.
Lowercasing Aubrey.
Are there any more questions for Aubrey? Aubrey, once again, thank you very much for a most entertaining afternoon. I think everybody's thoroughly enjoyed listening to you and your words of wisdom, and for the other people who've contributed to the meeting. I think we're going to close the meeting now and go for a cup of tea. We have recorded a meeting. I don't know how we're going to process it further from that, but I'll get Derek to assist me on that. But Aubrey, once again, many thanks. Many thanks to you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aubrey.
Thank you, Aubrey.
That was great.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you very
you.
much. Thank you.